Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the penultimate episode of Season 3 of the Word of the Day podcast. My name is Jamie Silva, I am your host, and seeing as how I'm here in the RAV4 studios, I think it's imperative that I pleasantly explain a useful word or two. The first of which, actually, is a word you just heard, penultimate, which, if you didn't know already, may have distracted you from the rest of the intro. This word, in addition to being the name of my new pen company, simply means second to last, or next to last, which is about the same thing. So, since each season of this podcast is 25 episodes long, and this here is episode 74, that again makes it the penultimate episode of Season 3. This word was suggested to us, by the way, by alert listener Dave, and although I don't think it has enough uses to warrant its own show, it's definitely useful in situations like this one. So, a quick shout out. Anytime you want to say second to last, you can say penultimate. Well, actually, that's not totally true, because penultimate always has to modify something, because it's an adjective, whereas second to last also operates as a number, or a rank, which means it can stand on its own if needed. So, saying, Patty finished penultimate in the 100-meter dash, barely escaping dead last. That is not correct. You would have to say, like, Patty was the penultimate finisher, or she was the penultimate runner to cross the finish line. Here, penultimate fills its proper role as an adjective, modifying finisher and runner, so all is right with the world. Now, penultimate sounds a lot fancier than second to last, and I guess it kind of is, but it's the same number of syllables at least, so technically it isn't using a longer word when a shorter would do. Etymologically, penultimate comes from two Latin words, meaning almost and last, which is logical, since the second to last of something is almost last, but not quite. This doesn't mean, by the way, that you can extend this logic and use the word ultimate as a substitute for last, at least not in English. Referring to what you were up to this ultimate weekend would just make people think you had, I guess, a super good weekend, but it's very confusing. In Spanish, though, I know you can do this. El último fin de semana would translate to last weekend, and notice the word there, último, for last. Okay, actually, I guess there was a bit more to say about penultimate than I thought, and it was a bit more interesting than I thought, so thanks for suggesting it, Dave. Anyone else who wants to suggest a word can always contact us at the show email address, which is wotdpodcast@gmail.com. And that is WOTD, as in word of the day. And if you were planning to do so, but haven't yet, might I suggest putting it on your to-do list, perhaps as the penultimate item, right before rating and reviewing this show on iTunes, which helps us gain more listeners and keeps the lights on in these here RAV4 studios. Which is actually a great reminder for us to turn off the lights in the studios after we're done recording. Because a couple times we've almost forgotten, which would have been really bad. Like, it could mean I go out the next morning and can't drive the studios to work because the battery's dead. Anyway, with this episode's first and penultimate word out of the way, I'd like to turn to the main feature, which is the noun and verb jest, J-E-S-T. This is pretty easy to use because it means the exact same thing as the noun and verb joke. So you might say, I have a great sense of humor. I appreciate a good jest. That's the noun. Or you could say, hey, don't be mad, I was just jesting. And that's the verb. Quickly here, the online version of the noun goes, quote, a thing said or done for amusement, a joke, unquote. And then the verb goes, quote, to speak or act in a joking manner, unquote. Okay, so these are just fine. For etymology, there are a few moving parts here, so bear with me. The first is that for many centuries, the root words for jest in Latin, Old French, and Middle English all had to do with performance and storytelling, and particularly telling stories about great feats, deeds, or exploits of days gone by. And often these stories would be set to song. About the 14th century, there arose something called a gestor, that is J-E-S-T-O-U-R, and I'm not positive of the pronunciation there, and this was defined as a minstrel, or professional reciter of romances. And I think, by the way, romances there is meant in the classic tales sense, not the star-crossed lovers sense. Now, later, in the medieval and Renaissance periods, many European royal courts would have jesters, that's J-E-S-T-E-R, which have entered into the popular imagination as kind of like early clowns. Poofy, brightly colored, weirdly patterned clothes, tells jokes, kind of creepy sometimes, that sort of thing. There are some distinctions between them that I'm going to gloss over for simplicity here, but the point is, at first, jesters were primarily storytellers. They were there to entertain the court with tales of excitement, or romance, or woe, or humor, as the case may be. And this is very much in keeping with the early meaning of jest we just talked about. Later on, jesters seem to have diversified their skill set to include song, dance, juggling, magic tricks, physical comedy, probably including unflattering impersonations of various noblemen, and, most notoriously, jokes and clever banter, especially of the disrespectful and insulting kind, which might seem like kind of an odd thing in a formal royal court setting, where everyone probably spent most of their time standing around trying to impress the monarch with their sage remarks and dignified bearing, when they weren't plotting his or her downfall, of course. But the jester's buffoonery often served an important purpose. Many accounts describe them as these speaking truth to power types, where, unlike the rest of the royal court, which again was composed of yes-men and flatterers and intrigue machines, the jester, despite holding no official power, or being of noble blood or whatever, or maybe actually because of this, they had full license to challenge the king or queen, make witty but uncomfortable observations about their wisdom or decisions, straight up poke fun at them even, all things that would have sent people of any real importance straight to the nearest dungeon. And humor was central to jesters' ability to get away with all this. Because, it was all in good fun. They were just making jokes and cracking wise and probably occasionally slipping on banana peels and falling down, just for giggles. I mean, you can't stay mad at that. But this isn't to say jesters always avoided crossing a line. Some were too offensive or offered the wrong witticism when the king was in the wrong mood, etc., and they'd be banished or worse because of it, which are pretty high stakes for comedy. Like, I've done the tiniest bit of stand-up myself, and that was nerve-wracking enough. Now imagine that it's in front of, the exact same audience every night, so your material's always got to be fresh, and at least one of those audience members, probably sitting in the middle of the front row, right where you can see them, can have you executed if they don't like your material. And on top of all that, part of your job is to be like an insult comic, and call out that audience member specifically now and again for some gentle ribbing. I tell you, that just sounds like Stress City to me. I mean, the turnover in that job must have been crazy high. Now, this type of person, this tell-it-like-it-is fount of wit and jollity, pops up frequently in Shakespeare's plays, where they were known not as jesters, but as fools. Sometimes they'd be an official one attached to a court or a king, but typically they'd just be some ne'er-do-well or peasant who alternately tells dumb jokes, makes silly puns, runs mental circles around his less quick-witted brethren upon the stage, and occasionally, with some pithy and perspicacious aside, highlights the absurdity of a situation, another character, life, what have you. And some of the most accomplished real-life professional jesters/entertainers of Shakespeare's time would perform in these roles, and many got super famous because of it. Queen Elizabeth was reportedly a huge fan, for example. And by the way, these people who exhibit an outward foolishness that makes you laugh but masks inner wisdom, or who, by virtue of their worldly ignorance, possess a childlike understanding of the simple truths of life that puts to shame the pretensions of those who ignore these truths. The term for these folks, in literature and elsewhere, is a wise fool, and they're a staple of many works of fiction, both past and contemporary. One example that leaps to mind would be Forrest Gump, of the classic eponymous film. Okay, so back to the main thread here. Perhaps because of this association between jesters and humor, the meaning of jest evolved from a narrative of past exploits and adventures to an idle tale to mocking speech or raillery, and raillery, it was basically like especially clever teasing or good-humored banter. And by the middle of the 15th century, jest basically meant a joke, or again, as a verb, to joke. And this is what we know it as today. One other interesting item I ran across while researching this word is the concept of a jest book, which is just a collection of jokes or humorous anecdotes. These reached peak popularity in Europe around the 17th and 18th centuries, but the earliest known version was put together in ancient Greece, in like the 4th century BC. It was called the philogelos, meaning, in Greek obviously, love of laughter. And to give you a bit of a flavor of it, here are a couple sample witticisms from this ancient collection. And we're just going to see how they go over with the Word of the Day staff here. Producer Pete has been warming them up already for about 10 minutes with his classic "What's the deal with sweater vests?" routine. So I think this is going to be good. Okay. Hey, how's everybody feeling tonight? All right. Folks, give it up for Producer Pete. How great was he? Yes. So, okay, guys. A man is talking to his friend, right? And he says to his friend, "Hey, remember that slave you sold me? Well, get this. He died the very next day." And his friend goes, "Oh, that's weird. He never did that when I had him." Is this check one? Is this on? Okay, so yeah, sure. That was a little edgy, I guess, although it was supposedly the inspiration behind the famous Dead Parrot sketch from Monty Python, which if you aren't familiar with it is definitely worth a watch. Okay, folks, let's do another. Is that all right? Doesn't matter. Okay, so there was once a glutton who betrothed his daughter to another glutton. Asked what he was giving her as a dowry, he replied, "A house whose windows face the bakery." Oh, guys, come on. Also, what have I told you about bringing in crickets? Okay, it's not okay. That's enough of this. We're done here. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. So in terms of usage, once again, jest is kind of old-fashioned, even archaic. So it's best used in a whimsical, sort of tongue-in-cheek way, where saying the word jest is a small joke in and of itself. And while theoretically jest is interchangeable with joke, I feel like it's most at home not in long sentences or descriptions, but in short exclamations or phrases. And here's what I mean. I think it sounds weird to be like, the Rehnquist cousins were all over in the corner laughing and jesting amongst themselves. Also weird would be something like, the comedian kept the audience in stitches with volley after volley of hilarious jests. Oh, sorry, what's that? No, that example is not referring to Producer Pete. That's cold, man. Folks, again, the staff here, I'm sorry, they're incorrigible. Anyway, I think the reason these uses for jests seem odd to me is because they're these matter-of-fact statements that don't have the chirpy good humor or self-aware quirkiness that I think the word jest sounds the most natural with. And again, this sense comes across best, I think, in short, compact statements. To show this, here are a few things you probably already say now and again, where jest fits right in. First, the phrase, "You gotta be kidding me," equals, "Surely you jest." If you haven't heard this one before, it probably sounds kind of funny, but I assure you it is a real phrase, and actually something people do still say now and again. Not super often, but definitely sometimes. And the situations where you would say this are like when someone says something so ridiculous, so out there that there is no way they could be sincere. They must be joking. Like, you might say, 70 miles per hour in a 45 zone? Are you sure about this, officer? It doesn't sound like me. Surely you jest. Or perhaps, wait. You're telling me you think Hawkeye is the only truly indispensable Avenger? Surely you jest. And how about one more, because superhero movies aren't a universal interest, whereas tacos are. So, waiter, excuse me, is this actually the Meat Lover's Supreme Authentic Tijuanan Taco? It is? Surely you jest. It's like 80% lettuce. Next, for the phrase, "just kidding," you can say, "I jest." As in, no, I don't actually think anyone who eats their hot dog from the middle like it's a watermelon slice is a psychopath. I jest, that's all. And lastly, instead of "no joke" or "I'm not kidding," how about "I do not say this in jest." As in, this birthday party clown we hired was so good at making balloon animals, I do not say this in jest. I was thinking about putting one of them on our mantelpiece in the living room, right next to the family photos. Yeah, like maybe a balloon narwhal, for example. I think it'd look great. And by the way, when I say in jest, that is two words, in and jest. Not like the verb ingest, which is a weird scientific term that just basically means to eat. Also, just like with people who say no joke, people who say, "I don't say this in jest," not that there are very many of these people, they're probably at least partially joking. Oh, and actually one more here, which isn't so much a phrase as it is a saying, but it's kind of a cool one. It goes, "Much truth is said in jest." Or, alternatively, many a true word is spoken in jest. And this sort of goes back to the idea of the jester as this person who, while it seems like they're just joking and goofing around, often are actually, whether purposely or not, dishing out these valuable insights, these nuggets of wisdom. And these insights might be very sobering when you think about them. It's just that the way they're delivered is humorous. So nowadays, this saying, "much truth is said in jest," basically means just because someone is joking doesn't mean they're not making a serious point on some level. Or, in another sense, a lot of truth about the world, people, what have you, is cloaked in humor. Okay, you know what? I think I'm going to let these stand as the examples for this episode. I mean, there are some neat old quotations from classic literature that use the word, but they do so mainly in the matter-of-fact way, not in the short, kind of tongue-in-cheek exclamation way. And since the latter is what you want for everyday conversation, I don't want to muddy the waters. So, I suppose that'll do it for us, and that'll do it for this, the penultimate episode of Season 3. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it, and I don't jest in the least when I say we are all most gratified that you did. This is your host, Jamie Silva, saying so long from the RAV4 studios on behalf of all of us here at the Word of the Day podcast. We hope you tune in again next time for the final episode of the season, and of course, all the other ones after that. And until you do, whatever you're doing, have a great one.